The transport truck had stopped hours ago, but the women remained inside, pressed against the wooden benches, listening to the muffled voices of American soldiers outside. When the canvas flap finally pulled back, grey light flooded in, and a blast of cold air followed. A sergeant with mud on his boots looked at them without expression and gestured toward the opening. One by one they climbed down, their legs stiff from the journey, their hands numb inside thin gloves that had holes in the fingertips. The camp spread before them in a grid of identical buildings, all the same shade of olive green, with metal roofs that gleamed dully under the overcast sky. Pathways of packed dirt connected one structure to another, and in the distance, beyond a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, bare trees formed a dark line against the horizon. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and something else, something warm and rich that none of them could immediately identify. They stood in a loose group near the truck, unsure whether to move or wait for instructions. A few of the women pulled their coats tighter, threadbare wool that provided little protection against the November chill. The youngest among them, barely 20, had wrapped a scarf around her head, but strands of dark hair had escaped and whipped across her face. She tucked them behind her ear with fingers that shook, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't have said. A corporal approached, carrying a clipboard and wearing a jacket that looked brand new. His face was young, clean-shaven, with a spray of freckles across his nose and cheeks that suggested he hadn't been in the military long. He studied the clipboard, then looked up at the assembled women, his eyes moving from face to face without lingering on any one person. He said something in English, his voice casual, almost friendly, and when no one responded, he tried again, slower this time, enunciating each word with exaggerated care. One of the older women, who had worked as a translator before the factories claimed her, stepped forward and answered in broken English. The corporal nodded, made a mark on his clipboard, and gestured toward one of the nearby buildings. The women followed, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath visible in small clouds that dissipated almost immediately. The building he led them to was larger than the others, with windows that ran the length of both sides and a double door at the front. As they approached, that smell grew stronger, and now they could identify it. Cooking meat, baking bread, onions, butter, things they hadn't encountered together in so long that the combination seemed almost fictional. The corporal pulled open one of the doors and stood aside, waiting for them to enter. Inside, the warmth hit them like a physical force. The temperature difference was so extreme that several women stopped just beyond the threshold, blinking against the sudden moisture that formed in their eyes. The space was enormous, easily twice the size of any factory floor they'd worked on, with rows of tables stretching from one end to the other. The tables were empty now, but you could see where they'd been used recently. Crumbs, water rings, a forgotten napkin crumpled beside a salt shaker. At the far end of the hall, a serving area had been set up, industrial in scale, with metal counters and steam tables and stacks of trays on wheeled carts. Behind the counters, soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, lifting lids, stirring contents, wiping down surfaces. The steam rose in thick columns, and through it you could glimpse the food itself. Actual food, not the thin gruel or stale bread they'd grown accustomed to, but substantial meals that occupied space on serving trays and required proper utensils. The corporal walked ahead of them, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, and stopped near the serving area. He turned to face the group, that same casual expression on his face, and he said something that the translator woman stepped forward to interpret. "Go ahead, eat. There's plenty more where that came from." The words hung in the air, strange and improbable, and for several seconds no one moved. Then the young woman with the scarf laughed, a short, sharp sound that broke the silence like glass shattering. The laugh was involuntary, born from disbelief rather than amusement, and it prompted a few others to join in. Nervous laughter, thin and uncomfortable, the kind that emerges when something feels too absurd to accept at face value. Plenty more where that came from. As if abundance could be taken for granted, as if there were no rationing, no shortages, no careful calculations about how to stretch resources until the next distribution. The corporal didn't seem offended by the laughter. He picked up a tray from one of the stacks, its surface reflecting the overhead lights, and held it out toward the nearest woman. She was middle-aged, with grey in her hair and lines around her mouth that suggested she'd spent years worrying about things beyond her control. She looked at the tray, then at the corporal, then back at the tray. Her hand reached out slowly, as if she expected him to pull it away at the last moment, but he just waited, patient and unbothered, until her fingers closed around the edges. The tray was heavier than she expected, solid metal rather than the thin aluminum or pressed cardboard they'd used in the camps. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, substantial and real, and she held it close to her chest as she turned toward the serving line. The other women began to move then, forming a queue that snaked through the tables toward the front of the room. They moved quietly, without speaking, each one taking a tray from the corporal as they passed. The first woman reached the serving station and stood there, looking at the soldier who waited behind the counter. He was young, maybe 19, with sandy hair cut close to his scalp and a name tag pinned to his apron that she couldn't read. He looked at her, then at her tray, and without asking what she wanted, he picked up a large serving spoon and dipped it into one of the metal containers. When he lifted the spoon, it held a thick slice of roast beef, dark brown on the outside and pink in the center, with juice running off the edges. He placed it on her tray in the center, where it settled with a weight that seemed impossible. She stared at the meat, her mouth opening slightly, and the soldier reached for another spoon, this one disappearing into a container of mashed potatoes. The potatoes emerged in a perfect dome, butter melting into the top, pooling in a small crater at the peak. He set this beside the meat, then added green beans, bright green and glistening with butter, and a roll that was still warm from the oven. The woman continued to stare, her grip on the tray tightening until her knuckles went white, and the soldier said something she didn't understand. His tone was neutral, perhaps slightly impatient, and he gestured toward the side, indicating she should move along. She shuffled sideways, making room for the next woman, but her eyes never left the tray. The meat alone was more than she'd seen in months, and the potatoes looked impossibly rich, and the beans were a color she'd almost forgotten vegetables could be. At the end of the line, another soldier placed a square of cornbread on her tray, followed by a pat of butter wrapped in waxed paper, and then a small bowl of what appeared to be apple cobbler, steam rising from the fruit beneath a golden crust. By the time she reached the beverage station, where a private poured coffee from a large urn into thick ceramic mugs, her hands were trembling. She took the mug, feeling the heat through the handle, and she carried her tray to the nearest table and set it down with exaggerated care. The surface of the table was wood, smooth and clean, with the grain visible beneath a layer of polish. She sat on the bench, her coat still buttoned to her throat, and she stared at the food arrayed before her. The other women filed through the line, each receiving the same generous portions, each responding with the same stunned silence. They filled the tables closest to the serving area, sitting with space between them, not speaking, not making eye contact. The young woman with the scarf received her tray and found a seat near the windows, where pale afternoon light filtered through and cast shadows across the table. She picked up her fork, standard-issue military cutlery, solid and well-balanced, and she turned it over in her hand, examining it as if she'd never seen one before. The fork's tines were straight, unbroken, and the handle had a slight curve that fit comfortably against her palm. She pressed the tines into the mashed potatoes and lifted a small portion to her mouth. The taste hit her immediately, butter and milk and salt, flavors that were simple but had become exotic through absence. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing, and she had to remind herself to swallow before taking another bite. Across from her, an older woman cut into her roast beef. The meat separated easily, tender enough that the fork slid through with minimal resistance, and when she lifted the piece to her mouth, juice dripped onto the tray below. She chewed methodically, her jaw working steadily, and something in her expression shifted, Not quite relief, not quite joy, but something complicated and hard to categorize. She swallowed, paused, then cut another piece. The translator woman sat at a table near the center of the room, her tray positioned directly in front of her, everything arranged in neat sections. She had worked in an office before the war, typing reports and filing documents and answering phones, and she approached the meal with the same systematic attention she'd once applied to paperwork. She ate the green beans first, one at a time, savoring each piece. Then the mashed potatoes, small spoonfuls that she held in her mouth until they dissolved. The roast beef last, cut into precise squares, each one chewed thoroughly before swallowing. The mess hall filled with the sound of eating, forks against trays, knives cutting through meat, the soft scrape of spoons against bowls. Occasionally someone would cough or clear their throat, but no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy, weighted with something none of them had words for. They ate with intense focus, as if the food might disappear if they looked away, as if the meal was a dream they could accidentally wake from. The corporal stood near the entrance, his clipboard held loosely at his side, watching the room. He'd done this before, overseen the first meal for new arrivals, and he knew what to expect. The silence, the disbelief, the way they ate slowly at first and then faster, as if making up for lost time. He'd seen it with Italian prisoners the year before, with German soldiers captured in North Africa, with Japanese POWs transferred from other camps. The pattern was always the same, and he'd stopped trying to make sense of it years ago. A sergeant walked through the mess hall, his boots clicking against the floor, and he paused beside the corporal. He asked if there were any problems, any incidents that needed to be reported. The corporal shook his head. "Everything's fine," he said, and the sergeant nodded and continued toward the exit. Through the windows, you could see the sky darkening, clouds moving in from the west, the light taking on that particular quality it has before a storm. The young woman with the scarf finished her roast beef and sat back against the bench. Her stomach felt full, uncomfortably so, stretched in a way it hadn't been in so long that the sensation was almost painful. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, feeling the firmness there, and she looked down at her tray. The mashed potatoes were gone, the beans were gone, the cornbread had left only crumbs. But the apple cobbler remained, steam no longer rising from it, the crust slightly soggy where it had absorbed juice from the fruit. She picked up her spoon and cut into the cobbler, scooping up apples and crust and the sweet syrup that pooled at the bottom of the bowl. She ate it slowly, letting the flavors sit on her tongue, cinnamon and brown sugar and something that might have been nutmeg. The apples were soft, cooked down until they were almost a paste, and they tasted like autumn, like holidays that felt impossibly distant. She ate the entire bowl, scraping the sides to get every last bit, and when she finished, she set the spoon down and closed her eyes. At another table, a woman who'd worked in a munitions factory was still eating. She'd taken her time with each course, spacing out the bites, trying to make the meal last as long as possible. Her hands bore scars from machinery accidents, white lines across her palms and fingers that had healed poorly, and she held her fork with a grip that was slightly awkward but functional. She cut her roast beef into increasingly smaller pieces, making sure each bite contained potato and meat and beans in equal proportion. When she finally finished, she sat with her empty tray in front of her and looked around the room. The other women were in various stages of completion, some still eating, others sitting in that same stunned posture she recognized from her own reflection. Near the serving area, the soldiers continued their work, refilling containers, wiping down counters, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested they had hours left in their shift and no particular urgency about any of it. The woman stood, picked up her tray, and walked toward the serving line. She moved slowly, uncertain of what she was doing or why, but compelled by something she couldn't articulate. The corporal noticed her approach and straightened, his expression shifting from neutral to something resembling curiosity. She stopped a few feet from the counter, holding her tray, and she looked at him with a question in her eyes that she didn't know how to phrase. The corporal seemed to understand anyway. He nodded toward the serving station, that same casual gesture he'd used earlier, and he said something that she didn't need translated to comprehend. She walked to the counter, where the young soldier with the sandy hair looked up from his work. He saw her empty tray, glanced at the corporal, then back at her. Without speaking, he reached for the serving spoon and placed another slice of roast beef on her tray. Another scoop of potatoes, more green beans, a second roll. The woman nodded her thanks, and the soldier nodded back, and she returned to her table with the same careful steps she'd used before. She sat down and began to eat again, this time without the same urgency, the flavors familiar now rather than shocking. At the next table over, another woman noticed. She finished her own meal, stood with her tray, and walked to the serving line. The pattern repeated, one woman after another, until half the room was receiving second helpings. The translator woman went back for more mashed potatoes and green beans, declining the meat because her stomach felt too full to accommodate another portion. The young woman with the scarf returned for a second piece of cornbread and more apple cobbler. An older woman who'd been a schoolteacher asked for extra rolls, and the soldier at that station gave her 3 plus 2 more pats of butter without comment or hesitation. They returned to their seats and continued eating, moving more slowly now, chewing each bite with deliberate attention. The laughter from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a silence that felt different from before. Deeper, more complex, tinged with something that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been some emotion that existed between those two poles and had no proper name. The translator woman cut into her second helping of mashed potatoes and paused with the fork halfway to her mouth. Her hand was shaking, just enough to be visible, and she set the fork down and pressed both palms flat against the table. The wood was warm from the heat of the room, smooth beneath her fingertips, and she could feel her pulse throbbing in her wrists. She took a slow breath, held it, released it, picked up the fork again and brought the bite to her mouth. Across the table, a woman who'd worked in a textile mill was crying quietly, tears running down her cheeks without any accompanying sound. She made no move to wipe them away, didn't seem aware of them, just continued eating her second helping of roast beef while the tears fell onto her tray and mixed with the gravy there. The woman next to her glanced over, then looked away quickly, respecting the privacy of the moment. The corporal remained by the door, his clipboard forgotten now, just watching the room with that same neutral expression. A chaplain passed through on his way to another building and stopped to exchange a few words. The corporal said everything was proceeding normally, no incidents to report, and the chaplain nodded and moved on. Through the windows, the light continued to fade, the sky turning from grey to charcoal, and someone turned on the overhead lights, fluorescent tubes that flickered once before illuminating the room in harsh white light. By the time the meal officially ended, marked by a bell that rang somewhere in the distance, the sun had set completely. The women began to stand, clearing their places, carrying trays to the designated collection area, where a private stacked them onto a rolling cart. They moved slowly, their bodies heavy with food, and they formed a loose line near the exit while waiting for instructions. The corporal consulted his clipboard and informed them, through the translator, that they would be taken to their barracks. He described the accommodations in basic terms: bunks, blankets, a washroom with running water. The translator repeated this information in German, her voice flat and professional, and the women absorbed it with the same stunned silence they'd maintained throughout the meal. The barracks turned out to be another long, prefabricated structure, similar in design to the mess hall but divided internally into sleeping areas. Metal-framed bunks lined both walls, 2 levels high with narrow aisles between them. A wood stove occupied the center of the space, radiating heat, and small windows near the ceiling provided ventilation. Each bunk had a mattress covered in striped ticking, a wool blanket folded at the foot, a pillow in a white case, and a small shelf mounted to the wall that could hold personal items. The women entered and dispersed through the space, selecting bunks with the same cautious efficiency they'd demonstrated earlier. Some chose lower bunks, others climbed the ladder to claim the upper level. The young woman with the scarf chose a middle bunk near the stove, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that she'd be uncomfortable. She sat on the edge of the mattress and tested the springs, which creaked slightly but held her weight without sagging. The pillow was stuffed with real feathers, she discovered when she pressed her hand into it. Not straw, not paper shavings, but actual down that compressed beneath her fingers and slowly regained its shape when she released the pressure. She pulled the pillow into her lap and held it there, feeling the weight of it, the softness, trying to reconcile this object with the thin, lumpy sacks she'd slept on in the transit camps. Beside her, the translator woman was examining the wool blanket, running her hand across the fabric, testing the weave. The blanket was thick, tightly woven, with a slight roughness that suggested it was new or nearly so. It smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, and when she unfolded it completely, she found it was large enough to wrap around herself twice. She refolded it carefully and set it at the foot of her bunk, then sat down and began unlacing her boots. The washroom was located at the far end of the barracks, behind a partial wall that provided some privacy without completely enclosing the space. It contained several sinks, a row of toilets separated by short dividers, and 3 shower stalls with canvas curtains. The woman who'd worked in the munitions factory walked through to investigate, turning on faucets to test the water pressure, checking inside the shower stalls to see what amenities were provided. When she turned on the shower, the water that emerged was hot, genuinely hot, not the lukewarm trickle they'd grown accustomed to. Steam rose immediately, fogging the small mirror mounted above the nearest sink, and she stood there for a moment, her hand under the spray, feeling the heat against her skin. She turned off the water and returned to the main area, where several women were already preparing for sleep. The young woman with the scarf had removed her coat and was sitting on her bunk in just her dress, which was thin and patched in several places, but cleaner than it had been in months. She'd taken off her boots and lined them up precisely beside her bunk, toes pointing toward the wall. Her stomach still felt uncomfortably full, a tightness that bordered on pain, and she lay down on her side, pulling the wool blanket over herself. The fabric was heavy, blocking out the draft that came through the gaps around the windows, and she closed her eyes against the overhead lights that were still on. Sleep didn't come easily. Her body was exhausted, but her mind wouldn't quiet, replaying the events of the day in fragmented loops. The roast beef, the mashed potatoes, the casual wave of the corporal's hand when he'd said there was plenty more. The taste of butter, real butter, not margarine or lard, but actual cream churned into solid form. The weight of the second helping on her tray, the way the soldier had served it without comment, as if abundance was ordinary rather than miraculous. In the bunk below, another woman couldn't sleep either. She lay on her back, hands folded over her stomach, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of being full. Her mind drifted through memories, comparing past and present, trying to make sense of the discontinuity. She thought about the factory where she'd worked, the 12-hour shifts, the constant hunger that gnawed at her even while she slept. She thought about the transit camp, the thin soup served once a day, the bread that was more sawdust than flour. She thought about the roast beef she'd eaten just hours ago, 2 helpings of it, and the apple cobbler that had tasted like something from a life that no longer existed. Somewhere near the back of the barracks, someone was crying, soft, muffled sounds that the person was clearly trying to suppress, but in the relative quiet of the room, they were audible. The woman in the lower bunk thought about getting up, about offering some word of comfort, but she didn't know what she would say. She couldn't comfort herself, couldn't make sense of her own emotions, so how could she help someone else? She stayed where she was, listening to the crying gradually subside, until eventually it stopped altogether. The days that followed established a pattern that became routine through repetition. A bell rang each morning at 6, and the women rose, dressed in the dim light that filtered through the windows, and made their way to the washroom. The water ran hot, always, and the soap provided came in thick bars that produced a dense lather. They washed their faces, their hands, their arms up to the elbow, and they returned to their bunks to dress in the clothes that had been issued to them. The clothes were simple but clean. Cotton dresses in muted colours, navy blue or grey or brown, with buttons down the front and a belt at the waist. Wool cardigans that provided extra warmth. Undergarments that still smelled faintly of starch. Heavy wool socks that fit inside the boots they'd been given. Leather boots with good soles that didn't have holes or worn spots. The young woman with the scarf ran her hand over her new dress, feeling the smoothness of the fabric, the evenness of the stitching. It fit properly, not too tight or too loose, and when she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the washroom sink, she saw someone who looked almost normal, almost like a person rather than a prisoner. Breakfast was served at 7. They lined up outside the mess hall, waiting for the doors to open, and when they did, they filed inside and collected their trays from the stacks near the entrance. The serving line offered scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, oatmeal, coffee, and small glass jars of jam in various flavours. The women moved through the line, receiving their portions, and they carried their trays to the tables and ate until they were full. The routine of it, the predictability, was almost as nourishing as the food itself. Knowing that breakfast would be there every morning, that the portions would be generous, that no one would take it away or announce it was a mistake, allowed them to eat with less anxiety, though the sense of disbelief never entirely faded. The translator woman ate her scrambled eggs with toast and jam, and she drank 2 cups of coffee with cream and sugar, and when she finished, she went back for oatmeal, just because she could. After breakfast came work assignments. The corporal appeared with his clipboard and read names from a list, assigning each woman to a specific task. Some went to the laundry, others to the kitchen, a few to the camp library. The assignments were given without explanation or consultation, and the women accepted them without question, following the soldiers who led them to their respective locations. The laundry was housed in a separate building that always smelled of bleach and steam. Industrial washing machines lined one wall, massive drums that tumbled loads of linens with a rhythmic thumping that could be heard from outside the building. The women assigned there worked in teams, sorting soiled linens, loading machines, transferring wet loads to dryers, folding clean items and stacking them on rolling carts. The work was hot, physically demanding, but not complicated, and they fell into the rhythm of it quickly. The translator woman found herself in the laundry more often than not, standing at a long folding table with 3 other women, smoothing wrinkles from sheets and pillowcases. The heat from the dryers made the air thick and damp, and her hair curled at the temples, sticking to her forehead. She wiped the sweat away with the back of her hand and continued folding, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought about her family often. Her parents, who'd been killed in a bombing raid early in the war. Her younger brother, conscripted into the army and sent to the Eastern Front, last heard from in the winter of '44. She'd written to the Red Cross multiple times, asking for information, providing what details she knew, but the responses had been vague and unhelpful. He was listed as missing, possibly captured, possibly dead. The uncertainty was worse than knowing, she thought, because it left room for hope, and hope was exhausting to maintain. The kitchen assignments were coveted because they meant working near food, though not necessarily eating more of it. The young woman with the scarf was assigned there one morning, tasked with peeling potatoes and chopping vegetables under the supervision of a cook who spoke broken German with an accent she couldn't place. The cook demonstrated each task with exaggerated hand gestures, miming the motions, and she followed along, peeling potatoes until her fingers ached and the pile of naked tubers had grown large enough to fill 2 large pots. The work was monotonous, but she didn't mind. It gave her hands something to do, occupied her attention enough that she couldn't think too deeply about other things. The cook occasionally brought her pieces of food to try. A slice of apple from the pie filling he was preparing, a bit of pastry dough rolled in cinnamon and sugar, a spoonful of soup that needed to be taste tested before serving. She accepted each offering and ate it slowly, nodding her approval, and the cook would nod back and return to his work. The library was the quietest assignment, staffed by women who could read and write with reasonable competence. The woman who'd been a schoolteacher found herself there, surrounded by books in English that she couldn't read and technical manuals that made no sense even when she recognized individual words. She was given the task of cataloguing, writing titles and authors onto index cards using a fountain pen with a fine nib that required careful handling. The work required precision, but not speed, and she spent hours sitting at a long table, copying information from title pages onto cards, forming letters with meticulous care. The library smelled of old paper and ink and the oil used to maintain the wooden floors, and the scent reminded her powerfully of her classroom, of the years she'd spent teaching children to read and write and think critically about the world around them. One afternoon, while shelving a stack of newly catalogued books, she discovered a collection of German poetry tucked between 2 volumes of American military history. She pulled it from the shelf carefully, recognizing the binding, the font, the particular edition. It was the same anthology she'd used in her classroom, the one she'd taught from for years, and when she opened it, she found her favorite poem on page 17, exactly where she'd expected it to be. She read the first stanza, then the second, her lips moving silently as she formed the words. The language felt like something she'd lost and then recovered, familiar in a way that transcended mere communication. She stood in the narrow aisle between the shelves, holding the book open in both hands, and she wept quietly while the librarian, an American corporal with glasses and a kind face, pretended not to notice. The infirmary was a small building near the administrative offices, staffed by a medical officer and 2 nurses who conducted examinations of all new arrivals within the first week. The young woman with the scarf sat on a narrow cot while a nurse wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm and pumped it tight. The nurse released the pressure slowly, watching the gauge, making notes on a clipboard. She listened to the young woman's lungs with a stethoscope, placing the cold metal against her back and instructing her through a translator to breathe deeply. The questions came next, delivered in English and translated into German. Had she been sick recently? Any ongoing health issues? Significant weight loss? The young woman answered as honestly as she could, describing the respiratory infection that had plagued her in the transit camp, the persistent cough that had finally cleared only recently, the fact that she'd lost weight but wasn't sure how much because she hadn't been weighed in over a year. The medical officer, an older man with greying hair and bifocals perched on the end of his nose, examined her thoroughly. He looked at her eyes, her throat, her teeth. He noted the malnutrition evident in her gums, which bled easily when he pressed them, and the cracked molar that would need attention. He scheduled a dental appointment and prescribed vitamins to be taken with meals until her weight stabilized. When the examination ended, she was given a small bottle of aspirin to manage the pain from her tooth and told to return in 2 weeks for a follow-up. The dental work happened on a Tuesday morning. The young woman with the scarf sat in a chair that reclined back until she was nearly horizontal, staring up at bright lights while the medical officer injected her gum with something that made her mouth go numb. He extracted the damaged tooth with tools that clicked and scraped, and he packed the empty socket with gauze and told her not to eat solid food for 24 hours. She returned to the barracks with her mouth full of gauze and blood, and she lay on her bunk for the rest of the day, feeling the steady throb of pain that the aspirin only partially dulled. The translator woman brought her soup from the mess hall that evening, lukewarm vegetable beef in a container with a lid, and she sipped it carefully, letting the liquid slide past the extraction site without disturbing the clot that was forming there. The seasons shifted gradually, autumn giving way to early winter. The temperature dropped, frost forming on the ground in the mornings, and the sky took on that pale, washed-out quality it has when snow is imminent. The wood stove in the barracks was stoked more frequently, and the women were issued additional clothing. Wool coats with buttons down the front, knitted scarves, gloves without holes in the fingertips. They wore these when they walked between buildings, their breath visible in small clouds, their boots crunching on ground that had frozen solid overnight. The mess hall adapted to the changing weather, serving hot soup for lunch alongside sandwiches. Chicken noodle, vegetable beef, tomato with grilled cheese on thick sliced bread. The steam from the bowls fogged the windows and left trails of condensation that ran down the glass in irregular patterns. The women ate their soup slowly, letting the heat warm them from the inside, and they went back for seconds and sometimes thirds, and no one commented or suggested they were taking more than their share. The translator woman began to notice changes in her body. Her dresses fit differently, tighter across the hips and shoulders, the buttons pulling slightly when she fastened them. Her face had filled out, the sharp angles of her cheekbones softening, and when she caught her reflection in the washroom mirror one morning, she almost didn't recognize herself. She looked healthier, certainly, but also different in some fundamental way that went beyond mere weight gain. She stood in front of the mirror for a long time, studying her face, touching her cheeks and jaw, and the hollow at the base of her throat that wasn't as pronounced as it had been. She thought about the food she'd been eating, the regular meals, the second helpings, the way she could now eat until she was genuinely full rather than just until the gnawing hunger subsided. She thought about the fact that she was a prisoner, technically, held in a camp behind fences and barbed wire, and yet she was gaining weight. The paradox of it occupied her thoughts for days. She found herself dwelling on it during work shifts in the laundry, while folding sheets and stacking them on carts, her hands moving automatically while her mind circled the same questions. What did it mean to be a prisoner who was fed well, who was given medical care, who was allowed to go back for second helpings without question? What did it say about the system, about the war, about the relative positions of captor and captive? The woman who'd been a schoolteacher thought about these questions too, though she approached them differently. She spent her lunch hours in the library, eating her sandwich while surrounded by books, and she found herself drawn to texts about American history, about the founding principles, about concepts like liberty and justice and the pursuit of happiness. She couldn't read the English text with full comprehension, but she could pick out enough words to get the general sense, and what she understood troubled her. If these principles were real, if they were meant to apply universally, then what did it mean that she was being treated humanely while her countrymen, while her students, while her brother somewhere on the Eastern Front had experienced or were experiencing conditions that were fundamentally inhumane? The question didn't have a simple answer, and she found herself returning to it repeatedly, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The young woman with the scarf didn't engage in this kind of philosophical contemplation. Her concerns were more immediate, more physical. Her extracted tooth had healed, the socket filling in with new tissue, and she could eat normally again. She worked in the mess hall now, assigned there permanently after demonstrating reliability during her initial shifts. She refilled condiment dispensers, wiped down tables between meal services, swept the floor at the end of each day. The work brought her into regular contact with the American soldiers who ran the mess hall, and over time she began to pick up English words and phrases. The soldiers spoke to her in simple sentences, pointing to objects and saying their names slowly. Ketchup, napkin, tray, salt, broom. She repeated the words back to them, her accent thick but her pronunciation clear, and they nodded encouragement and moved on to the next word. One of the privates, a young man with red hair and a gap between his front teeth, took a particular interest in helping her learn. During slow periods, he would quiz her, pointing to things around the mess hall and waiting for her to name them. When she got it right, he'd smile and say good job, and when she struggled, he'd repeat the word patiently until she could reproduce it accurately. The process was slow, incremental, but she found she enjoyed it, enjoyed the sense of progress, the accumulation of knowledge. The private sometimes brought her food between shifts, a piece of cake left over from lunch, a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper, an apple from the kitchen stores. He would set it on the table in front of her with a simple gesture and a few words that she'd learned to understand as an invitation to eat. She always thanked him in German, and he always nodded and went back to his work, and the exchange became routine enough that she stopped feeling surprised by it. The seasons continued their progression, winter settling in fully. Snow fell in early December, light dustings at first, and then heavier accumulations that required shoveling. The women were given this task, assigned to clearing paths between buildings, and they worked in teams with shovels and brooms, pushing the snow into piles at the edges of the walkways. The work was cold, physically demanding, but not unpleasant exactly. It got them outside, gave them exercise, broke up the monotony of indoor assignments. Christmas came, and with it, a special meal. Turkey instead of roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, stuffing, cranberry sauce, rolls, green beans, and pie for dessert. The mess hall was decorated with paper chains and a small tree in the corner, hung with ornaments made from tin and coloured paper. The women filed through the serving line and received their portions, and they sat at the tables and ate while carols played from a radio someone had brought in. The corporal, Sullivan, stood near the door as always, but he wasn't holding his clipboard. He was just watching, his expression unreadable, and when the chaplain stopped by to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, Sullivan nodded and responded with something brief that the chaplain seemed to accept. The meal lasted longer than usual, the women eating slowly and going back for multiple servings, and when it finally ended, they filed out into the cold afternoon air, where snow was falling again in large, soft flakes. Back in the barracks, the translator woman lay on her bunk with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Her stomach was uncomfortably full, stretched to the point of pain, and she had to breathe shallowly to avoid making it worse. She thought about the turkey, the stuffing, the pie with its lattice crust, and the sweet filling that had tasted like cinnamon and apples, and something else she couldn't identify. She thought about Christmas dinners from before the war, about her family gathered around the table, about traditions that had been disrupted and might never resume. The new year arrived without particular fanfare. The women continued their routines, their work assignments, their meals in the mess hall. The translator woman gained more weight, enough that she had to request a larger dress, which was provided without comment or judgment. The young woman with the scarf became more fluent in English, able to hold simple conversations with the soldiers she worked alongside. The woman who'd been a school teacher catalogued hundreds of books and found occasional volumes in German that she would read during her breaks, losing herself in familiar language and stories. The war ended in stages, news filtering into the camp through radios and newspapers that the women weren't allowed to access directly but heard about from the soldiers. Surrender in Europe, then in the Pacific, then the slow process of repatriation and reorganization. The women didn't know what would happen to them, whether they'd be sent back to Germany or held indefinitely, and no one could give them definitive answers. But the routine continued. Meals were served 3 times a day, work assignments were given each morning, medical care was provided as needed. The translator woman worked in the laundry and ate regular meals and gained weight until her reflection in the washroom mirror showed someone she barely recognized as herself. The young woman with the scarf worked in the mess hall and learned more English and ate second helpings without thinking twice about it. The woman who'd been a school teacher catalogued books and read German poetry and wondered what had happened to her students, to her school, to the world she'd known before everything changed. Late one afternoon in March, the corporal appeared in the barracks with his clipboard and announced that they would be processed for repatriation within the next few weeks. The translator repeated this information in German, and the women absorbed it with the same stunned silence they'd maintained throughout their time in the camp. They would be going home, or at least back to Germany, to whatever remained of the places they'd come from. That night, the young woman with the scarf lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She thought about going back, about what she would find there. The factory was probably destroyed. The apartment building where she'd lived was certainly gone, bombed early in the war. Her friends, her neighbours, the people she'd known, scattered or dead or changed beyond recognition. And she was changed too, she realised. Not just in body, but in some fundamental way that she couldn't fully articulate. She'd spent months eating regular meals, working reasonable hours, sleeping in a warm bed with a real mattress and a wool blanket. She'd been treated, if not kindly exactly, then at least humanely, given medical care and clothing and food without having to beg or fight for it. And now she was going back to a place where none of that could be taken for granted, where scarcity and deprivation would likely be the norm for years to come. The translator woman had similar thoughts. She lay in her bunk and considered the weight she'd gained, the health she'd recovered, the relative comfort of her existence over the past several months. She thought about returning to Berlin, to the rubble and the shortages and the chaos of reconstruction. She thought about her brother, still missing, still unaccounted for, and the likelihood that she would never learn what had happened to him. She thought about the roast beef and mashed potatoes, the second helpings, the casual wave of the corporal's hand when he'd said there was plenty more. The woman who'd been a schoolteacher thought about her students, about the children she'd taught to read and write and think. She wondered how many had survived, how many had been killed in bombings or conscripted or caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in starting. She thought about the German poetry anthology in the library, about the familiar words that had felt like a connection to something that still existed despite everything that had been destroyed. The weeks before repatriation passed quickly. The women continued their routines, continued eating their meals, continued working their assignments. They were measured for travel clothes, given new coats and shoes, issued small bags to carry personal items. The process was efficient, impersonal, conducted with the same methodical attention that had characterized everything else about the camp. On their final evening, they ate dinner in the mess hall one last time. The menu was roast beef and mashed potatoes, the same meal they'd received on their first day, and the symmetry was